I'm Bob McCahey, I'm in the history department, and I don't give out numbers.
I'm Louise Bernicow, and I'm proud to say class of '61 at Barnard, and I'm working on the women's suffrage fight in New York City, which is how I came to know Annie Nathan Meyer, who was the leading anti-suffragist of the world, more or less.
I'm Arlene Weiner, and I'm the class of '54. I'm giving numbers. And in the Centennial, Barnard Centennial, I did an oral history project. I conducted an oral history project with Millicent McIntosh, among many others. And so when I heard about this, it fascinated me. And I have some really cool stuff from the archives that I made copies of.
Wonderful.
Do we have a regular archivist now?
We do.
We
They're-
do.
they're in-
Because it's been on and off for a long time.
Yeah, no,
Martha said she's going to try.
It is on.
Right,
She's
because when I was in the process, I
Yeah.
was just sent to find things myself.
No, and they're about to launch a digital archive where some of this material that I've been putting together, I hope will
Yeah.
go up, and whatever
They
you
have
have
a
would be
digital
great.
archive.
I
You
have
can
some
search
interesting
women's
stuff.
suffrage at Barnard and find,
But there's something, they're putting that into a different format.
oh,
Yeah,
but
but that's gonna be included,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
Wonderful.
Connie?
I'm Connie Brown, class of '71, current registrar and member of the English department.
I'm Sue Reamer Sachs. I came to Barnard in 1971, and I was the head of the education program for a long time until 2005 when Lee Bell was hired as the director, and I retired from that. And I teach in the psychology department, 2 courses, 1 each term, and yeah, it's fun. Good way to transition out.
Holden?
I'm Holden Zimmerman. I'm a current sophomore. I'm Professor McCahey's main intern, I guess, and I do most of his IT work.
I'm Celeste Rivera, class of '04, and I work in alumni affairs. I work with the classes of the '70s and all of our regional programming.
I'm Allison Joseph, class of 2001, and I was an American Studies major, and I focused on thinking about women in higher education and wrote my senior thesis about the founding of Barnard. And I attended the last meeting virtually through Skype, so
I was going to say,
that's
last
great.
time I saw you.
Which was great, and also distracting for me, and I hope not too distracting for you. And I'm currently teaching at Villanova University in their first year seminar program.
Hi, I'm Jamie Coffey. I am currently in the role as interim Director of Alumni Affairs, trying to fill Erin's very big and important shoes until we find the new director. I was before that in President Sparr's office as her executive assistant and chief of staff. I've been at Barnard for almost 5 years, off and on. So this is beginning of week 3, so I have a lot of information in my head. But it's an honor to be here, and I can't wait to listen in on the discussion, so thank you.
I'm Rhoda Wilk, class of '91. I was an English and history major and a graduate of Professor Rosenberg's American Women in the 20th Century class. And I got my PhD in American history at NYU and have written both my senior thesis, my master's thesis on women's college culture, in a number of articles on Barnard culture. I wrote a column for the Bulletin my senior year. So,
where are they?
where are they? The
Articles on Barnard culture.
well, there's one in the American, what is it, the OAH magazine?
I'll get it.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Rivera. I'm class of '09. I am friends with Luis for a number of years, and I also was a student of Professor Rosenberg's.
I'm Lillian Appel, Director of Major Events and Programs here at Barnard, where I've worked for the last 37 years. And my daughter is a classmate of Allison's, actually. She graduated the same year. And I'm just an interested party here.
I just want to add that I was in a class with Professor McCarthy. He doesn't want no colors.
A man never reveals his age.
Yeah, but I think we ought to impose a certain startup discipline and the number one irrespective. Jewish problem, there are probably two people we would be well served to have here, neither in a position to. Harold Wexler is a PhD from Columbia in the mid-1970s, also at Columbia College. Wrote a terrific book on, with a terrible title, something like Selective Admissions to American Colleges, but it was really about the Jewish problem, and it was mostly focused on Columbia. And just about everyone that I know of who has written on other institutions, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, usual suspects, have deferred to Harold and not done Columbia. So it's a book now of 35 years or so, but it continues, I think, to hold up. And then his wife, Lynn Gordon, who was a graduate in the early 70s, who died a couple of years ago. She was professor of history and education up at the University of Rochester, and had written on Annie Nathan Meyer at a couple of different points in her career. She's quite a prolific historian. Harold will get back next year, I hope, because he's back up at Rochester on a leave, and he was interested in coming, but he couldn't. We do have, though, Louise Bernicow, class of '61, and
Hi.
Are you there? Sorry to interrupt.
all right.
Okay, I don't know why it says you're online on my iPhone, but not my iPad,
Oh.
but we're on. Oh, Allison, we switched places.
Yeah, you have. Can you hear us, see us?
I can see both of you.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Who's that?
Good timing.
Introduce yourself and affiliation.
Hi, Janet Alperstein, Barnard 92.
Hi, Janet.
I work for New York University.
Okay, then let's begin. We've divvied up the first 15 minutes of the discussion with asking Louise to talk a bit about her research, specifically with Annie Nathan Meyer, and specific to some of these issues that come up under this rubric that we've used, and then asked Roz to speak about the issue somewhat more generally, but also touch on the biography of Virginia Gildersleeve as it plays into this issue. And then I'll do some stitching together as best it seems. Louise.
Okay, as I said, I've been working on the New York City part of the suffrage campaign. 2017 is the centennial. New York women won the vote in 1917, and there will be hoopla. And so I've been writing the history of the New York movement, and even though I went to Barnard and I had heard the name Annie Nathan Meyer, I really didn't know a lot about her. And so when I encountered her sharp, shall we say, writing against women's suffrage, I got very interested, particularly, this is not our subject, in the family story of the Nathans, because I think that's important in terms of anti-Semitism, but also in the difference between Annie, who had an older sister named Maud, who was a very passionate advocate of women's suffrage. And the few commentaries I've seen say that the sisters were on opposite sides because of sibling rivalry. So one thing I want to say is that the over-psychologizing of women's politics makes me nuts. And I think some of the things about Virginia Gildersleeve and Annie Nathan Meyer sound the same to me. You know, they hated each other as though it were impossible to have different opinions about things. Annie Nathan Meyer was from the oldest Sephardic Jewish family in New York City. Benjamin Cardozo was her first cousin, so all the things that talk about Cardozo as the first of the new wave of Jewish trustees at Columbia. Don't say that, but it's all in the family. And she always said that she thought of herself as an aristocrat. Whether it's true, I haven't traced the genealogy, maybe Bob or someone has, but Annie claimed descendants from not only a trustee at King's College, Columbia University, but also the founders of the Virginia colony and the Civil War, the Revolutionary and the Civil War heroes. She and her sister were both members of the DAR. So that when Annie thought about Jews, Jewish people, she really didn't include herself. Being an aristocrat was really what she was, and I hope we can get into this as we discuss things, so that many of the things Annie says and does for quite a long time in Barnard's history, she's not part of it. She doesn't think that the Jewish question really applies to her. And it's Hitler who made her aware that it does. Because in the 1930s, I think we've read in some of the readings about the controversy over Jacob Schiff and naming the building that he had donated after him, and the I've read all the things Lynn Gordon read, and I hope we all had a good time in the Hebrew Archives in Cincinnati. The correspondence over the decision, her urging that the building be named for Jacob Schiff, and her claim that it's because of anti-Semitism that it's not being named after him, is one of several things that happened in the 1930s to Annie. She had horrendous fights with Nicholas Murray Butler over his, how shall we say, embracing of Nazis. He had, in the same year that the Schiff controversy occurred, which is 1933, President Butler had invited the German ambassador to speak at Columbia, and not only were there student opposition to it, but Annie very firmly complained about it, and there are some she hunted down or insisted on, can't remember his name, the head of the American Museum of Natural History, who she insisted had a Nazi past. And so there's a huge difference in her attitude toward Jews, depending on what year it is. And I think the whole question of Jewish problems at Barnard, yes or no, really is contextualized by history. I'm the only one here without a PhD in history, so I have to say it depends on what year. Certainly in the First World War period, anti-Semitism is extremely common in America, and particularly in New York. It's American history, New York history, political history at that time, and many of the things I've read seem quite common, and Annie does not object to it or stand up for the Jewish people at all. The other thing I want to say as fast as I can is, which, there are Jews and there are Jews. So Annie doesn't identify with any Jewish community, really. She's above and beyond it. The German Jews in New York City in those early years, up through the First World War, are the merchant class who have made a whole lot of money, and their daughters go to Barnard. So the names that I've seen repeated, we had I can't remember who they are. But Bob has written them, other people have written them. Those are the daughters of the accomplished German Jewish middle class. It's the ones who came when my parents did. It's the Lower East Side, Eastern European Jews that gets everybody's backup. Annie married a man named Dr. Albert Meyer, who was an expert in pulmonology, chest things, and he is one of the leading doctors who worked on tuberculosis. And it was said at the time that TB was the disease that those Jews on the Lower East Side were bringing to America, which wasn't true. The statistics are there was no higher rate of TB among Jews than among any other population, and he was a German Jew. So I imagine that the culture of their household was extremely, might call it anti-Semitic, but it's a class issue. That the antipathy toward the great unwashed Jews from Eastern Europe who were flooding New York City is what I see in the remarks of Annie's that sound like they're anti-Semitic, but they're very specifically against that class of Jews. I think that's 5 minutes.
Good. Excellent.
One of the things I found interesting about Harold Wexler's excellent piece is that he's talking about Columbia, but the assumption is that what was happening at Columbia was also happening at Barnard. And I was wondering to what extent that really was the case. And I'll just mention 3 or 4 moments in the early 20th century that I think show difference and also similarities. One of my favorite documents in writing, changing the subject, the history of women at Columbia, which was really a history of women at Barnard, but it was Columbia's anniversary, and so history sometimes dictates the title one chooses. But the document that I found most astonishing was from 1906, and it was a letter from the bursar at Barnard at the time, Mrs. Liggett, to the treasurer of the Board of Trustees, George Plimpton, talking about how worried she was about the number of Jews who were coming to Barnard. And she included a list which very helpfully had little red dots next to some of the students' names. And there were 102 students in the class of 1910 and 40 red dots. So there were approximately 40% of the class in 1906 was Jewish, and she thought that this was very worrying and likely a result of Barnard's coming to draw more of its students from the public high schools. Because of the Jewish students, 11 were from private schools, but the rest were from public schools. And public schools were new. Public high schools were new to New York in the 1890s, and so this was a relatively recent development. She thought it was alarming. Point number 1. In 1911, Virginia Gildersleeve became Dean of Barnard. She had graduated from Barnard in 1899, earned her MA in English at Columbia 2 years later, her PhD in English in 1908. She was a student of Nicholas Murray Butler, and Butler had been looking for a dean of Barnard for 4 years, actually, and in the interim had William Brewster as a provost, and liked working with Brewster specifically because he was a man so much that he thought that Brewster would be a great president, and the Board of Trustees at Barnard said, no, has to be a woman. It ends up being Virginia Gildersleeve, and Butler tries to redefine the position of dean as dean of students, and she said, well, thank you very much, but I want to be dean of students and dean of the faculty and in charge of finance, and if you don't allow me to do that, which has always been the case at Barnard, I won't do it. So he refuses to make a public announcement of his capitulation, but she's dean. In the full terms that had been true before her. So I say that to indicate that that Gildersleeve and Butler's relationship was a complicated one. He was her mentor, but they didn't always see eye to eye. And in the early years, she showed some startling independence. She insisted on a campaign to open every single professional school at Barnard, at Columbia, out to women, and in 1942 she finally succeeded with opening the School of Engineering to women. But most interesting for this discussion, she was part of a movement at Barnard beginning in 1913 with the faculty to ban fraternities, sororities at Barnard. There was a 3-year period between 1913, when the faculty agreed with Gildersleeve that the fraternities were an anti-democratic and anti-Semitic set of institutions at Barnard. And the students fought it out for the next 3 years. The most interesting battle, I thought, was among 3 students. I'm supposed to talk about Gildersleeve and students, I think. So I've got 3 students. One was Sarah Butler, all class of 1915, daughter of Nicholas Murray Butler. The next one was Margaret Meyer, daughter of Annie Nathan Meyer. And the third was Frida Kirschway, daughter of the former dean and pacifist and prison reformer at the law school, who was who campaigned most militantly to be sure that the fraternities, sororities stayed banned. And by 1916 that happened. So there was this sense at Barnard of being a place that had to be democratic and institutions that militated against this democracy should be banned. Forward to 1920. And this is where I think Wexler's article is particularly helpful, because World War I really presents a crisis and an opportunity at Columbia. A crisis because the number of Jewish students is really getting completely out of control. Although the numbers, and Bob, maybe you can speak to this. It was easier to find some numbers at Barnard than at Columbia. And the numbers that I recall were that Columbia had about 20% of its students then were Jews. That at City College it was at that point about 80%. Could it be that high? At Hunter College about 40%.
Fordham about 35%.
35, right? And there was a question. All right, what are you going to do about all of these Jews at Columbia? And having the opportunity to train officers for World War I at Columbia brought many more students to campus, but also an opportunity to filter them more quickly through a test that was devised by Thorndike at Teachers College. I love this test. I gave this test every single year in American civilization since the Civil War when we got to World War I, and students always flunked it. This was a test that was supposed to demonstrate mental IQ, mental ability, and it was going to weed out the Jews, because as you see from the letter from Hawks, the Columbia administrators believed fervently that Jewish students were overachievers, that they performed in excess of their mental ability. And this test was going to radically reduce the numbers. In the beginning, there was a reduction of the numbers. And I always wondered, well, how'd they do it? So I found the test. And there are 2 questions that really seemed to me dynamite questions. One was, what is the name of the pointed end of an anvil? And the other was, Thorndike grew up in a small town in, I think, Midwest. And the other was, what is between the transmission and, I've got to look, I can never remember these things about cars, between the transmission and differential of an automobile. What joint is situated between the transmission and the differential of an automobile? Wow. Okay, I submit that kids on the Lower East Side are not likely to spend a lot of time with anvils or automobiles. I mean, who drives in New York? And so one of the reasons that the Jews, and I suspect the Catholics, didn't do so well in these tests was that they had not grown up in small towns in Ohio. And didn't know the answers to them. In case you have forgotten, those of you who were in American civilization since the Civil War, the pointed end is a beak, and the joint is the universal joint. That was
such valuable.
This relates. So I mean, we know that IQ tests can be culturally situated, right? There is the point here in the head to the letter from Hawks to Wilson. The point that there was a joint admissions committee between Columbia and Barnard from 1909 to World War II. But my question remains, was there nonetheless difference between Barnard and Columbia? And certainly Gildersleeve was very concerned by 1920 about the Jewish problem at Barnard. And she wrote to Butler asking whether it would be all right if Barnard used this test, but warning him that she wasn't sure that she'd be able to succeed because she had to present this to the Barnard faculty, and she wasn't sure she could get the Barnard faculty to go along with this, which makes me think that there was at least some pushback from some quarters of Barnard to this fear of the flood of Jews. Gildersleeve has some difficulty. It takes a year of faculty meetings. All of us who've sat through many faculty meetings know that you don't go for an entire year of faculty meetings without voting on something unless there's something to talk about. And there was a lot of debate about whether this was a violation of the campaign to eliminate sororities, that this was a fundamentally undemocratic thing to do. In the end, the faculty agreed to a trial, and the trial lasted 10 years. And I'm actually not sure what effect that it had. But I raise it just to say that I think that there was some debate, at least among the faculty, about whether Barnard was going in the right direction. Okay, two more things. The letter to Wilson from Hawkes in reaction to an editorial in The Nation. Nothing really said about the editorial in The Nation except that you can never trust people of The Nation to write anything you can believe. You know, they don't have much respect for the truth. The writer of the editorial was the managing editor of The Nation, who was Frida Kirschway. And Frida Kirschway had done a tour of all of the colleges in New England, but was particularly exercised about the changes in admissions at Columbia with the mental test and changes in the application form, which required a specification of religion and all sorts of other involvement in social activities and in sports. And she says, this is going to discriminate against Jews because the clubs won't allow the Jews in. So how can they put that down on their application and get into Columbia or Barnard? So the pushback from Barnard continues into the Nation. Finally, there's no finally, but the last thing I'll mention is that in 1924, Gildersleeve made one other effort to try to control the influx of Jews into Barnard, and that was in the creation of the Seven Sisters. Barnard and Radcliffe both had the problem of being in the shadow of a larger research university. Very hard to raise funds. Why do you need money? You're part of this big, rich university. But also had the largest number of Jews, both at about 20%. For all of their efforts, they couldn't get it down lower than 20%. The sense was that if only they could be associated in the public eye with Bryn Mawr and Mount Holyoke, 6% Jews. Vassar, Smith, and Wellesley, 10% Jews. That it would be possible to be seen as a more middle class, really American place.
Okay, thank you. I guess I have a little different Virginia Gildersleeve. I'm a little harder on her earlier on, and I tend to agree with your take on her later on. This is a tough woman. I don't think she ever crossed Nicholas Murray Butler at any time. I think there were differences, and she was always pushing for her Barnard women to get into professional school. But I think when Butler said jump, most of the time she wanted to know how high. She was not his first choice, but she was his first choice, I think, as a woman, if you have to have a woman. And then he came up with, what did he call it? a flower from Barnard's own little garden or something. And as far as the, we haven't, and we may never, because the documents are pretty thin at different times, and sometimes you're depending on Columbia documents, and sometimes the Barnard ones tell a better story, or tell a different story. But I think that 1909 agreement, where there was a merger of, there was a single undergraduate admissions committee that handled admissions for both the college and Barnard down through the 1930s, makes much of the combination of various steps that Columbia took to keep down the numbers. Never acknowledging or admitting or maybe even thinking they had a quota. But boy, the capacity to stay right in that range,
Really, year after year.
between 20 to 22%, they might just as well have had a quota. But they realized, as even that Hawks letter said, that Harvard just blew it by being so open about their intentions, and the faculty there was embarrassed and repudiated the idea of public announcement, but you didn't hear much for the next 15 years. That in practice, the number was staying at about 15%. So I think this committee did the deed and kept the number of applicants from succeeding from the public high schools. Some of it, I think, was almost an anti-New York, anti-public school situation, but a good bit of that, I think, is just code for Jewish students. I spent a lot of time when I was doing the Columbia book sort of trying to understand Columbia's position, because of course the records are coming from those folks. And there was a problem that had to be dealt with. Herb, if you can hit the button, we're just going to move the slide along. The term Jewish problem is, just to advance the, great, okay. This may give you some sense of what's going on here. And it speaks to Louise's point about really three waves of Jewish immigration into the city. As late as 1880, we're talking about probably under 5%. And that means the German Jewish wave has already crested by 1880. So until that happened, you were down in the 1% district. You had the Nathans and the Cardozos and a couple of other families, but that was pretty much it. And I date the emergence of the problem somewhere in the 1890s. And if you look at it, go one more, Herb, and you can get a different sense. That's a percent of Jews in New York. And it goes up to it's the climb from 1900 to 1920 that is besetting the Columbia trustees. They don't know how to handle it.
And everybody else.
And part of the problem was that it's of their own making. That Nicholas Murray Butler spent a lot of time as dean of the faculty of philosophy and really a kind of co-president of Teachers College, altering the educational makeup of the city of New York, and altering the college entrance board exams and uniform entrance examinations, all of which made it much easier for high schools to adopt strategies for their bright kids to become college prep students and show up at Columbia, apply, and have to be acknowledged that they were academically acceptable. That really did it then. I interviewed Eli Ginsberg, who used to be over in the business school for many years. Actually, he has an autobiography that's very relevant to this case because he's the first Jewish member of the Harvard Business School. He went to the Columbia Business School. Went to Columbia in the 1920s when there were certainly a number of Jewish students, but he felt he was really pretty much on his own. He says that when you went to high school in the early 1920s in New York City, in the 9th grade, it was 1/3 Italian, 1/3 Irish, and 1/3 Jewish. And then when the kids turned 16, all the Italians left and all the Irish left, and the Jews were the only ones left. So when you got to graduation, it was a class of much smaller than before you got to the minimum age that you could leave. And these were the kids who were going to CCNY, and they were going to NYU. And CCNY's numbers, as you pointed out, CCNY was a Catholic school, I mean, in demography into the 1890s. But by the 1920s, it was, part of it may be a growth of some Catholic schools that drew some of those kids off, but most of it was that this was a logical place to go. Well, if you were paying attention in New York City, Columbia was a reach, but it was, it connects up with the subway just as easily as City College does. And the trick was, and that's where Roz's numbers really become interesting as far as Columbia. It is 20% from about 1915 on into the end of the 1930s, but there's a spike that occurred. There's a series of spikes that occur in February of every year. There's a certain attrition, and then the kids from City College will apply. And I don't know whether it's still the case, but it's somewhat different set of requirements filling those seats and beds in the second semester. And it was the strategy for a City College kid who was counting pennies to make this work was to go to City College for 2.5 years, then transfer it to Columbia for 1 year, and that would make you eligible for the professional schools. And there was still a certain amount of, there was still discrimination, the medical school rather more so than the law school, but the law school was reasonably open, more so than the college, I think more so than Barnard. So if you were playing it strategically, you'd save all your nickels and dimes, go to City College, where you've got a perfectly good education. Transfer as a junior, spend 1.5 years here, and you're in the law school, and you've got the whole can of the wax in you in 5 years. You're through professional school. Please?
You're talking about boys. Okay.
Yeah. I'm talking about boys, but what Virginia Gildersleeve, and the problem at Columbia was that. The problem at Barnard was a very different one, I think, because they never had a traditional constituency. They were thinking about Wellesley's constituency, Bryn Mawr's constituency. So to me, the case at Barnard was harder to rationalize in my mind at this point. Of course, I'll have to change because I've got to write a book about it. But at this point, it was something of a fantasy, where at Columbia at least, you could say there was a traditional student party. It was tiny, it wasn't very bright, and it was entirely Knickerbocker. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, out of old Dutch families, old Anglican families, who had been sending their kids to Columbia since the 1780s, and some of them back to King's College before that. And what was happening even before that spike in New York City population, where Jews become, by the 1920s, 30% of the population, and probably the graduating high school population, something like double that proportion. But Columbia had started to lose students, students of our kind, as early as the 1880s, because New York families of that upper crust were sending their boys away to prep schools. And if you went to a prep school, nobody was going to be with you if you then ended up at Columbia. You were going to go to Princeton if you went to that prep school. You were going to go to Harvard if you went to this prep school. So it was panicky from the 1890s on. Why Barnard followed that, I still don't really know it. To Roz's point, it seems to me you can make a case, as we have just about at every point in Barnard's history. It may be tough at Barnard, but it's worse at Columbia. It's a perfectly good argument. We use it a lot. I've heard with reference to the registrar's office, to the history department, to just about any situation. But it seems to me that Barnard had two trustees who were Jewish at the outset. That's two more than Columbia had. Columbia had your Sextus is, Gershon Sextus was a member of that Nathan, extended Nathan family. And when Columbia points to that it had an early Jewish trustee, they're absolutely right. Unfortunately, if you look into it, he was appointed by the state. And when he left in 1813, having hung in to it, it was another 109 years before they replaced him. So there's a considerable, the first appointed Jewish trustee to Columbia University is in 1928. When Barnard got started, it had both Annie Nathan Meyer, who they could hardly keep off because of the work she had done, sort of stimulating. Founder, I'm not sure, but certainly a principal. And Jacob Schiff, who was seen, if you're going to tap in, and that's what I think they were equal opportunity mendicants looking for money. Schiff was probably the richest Jew in the city, and had a leadership role among Jewish families in the city. And to put him on the board was an opening that Columbia was not prepared to do for another 40 years. But then it turns, and that's why I keep thinking that somehow Gildersleeve is a party to this kind of souring on making Barnard different from Columbia in this respect. But I don't have that much real evidence. Again, using Ginsberg, he talks in a very violent fashion about Virginia Gildersleeve's treatment of colleagues of his who were sent over to Barnard looking for jobs who were Jewish. Just sent them packing. And Dorothy Denberg, who's not here, sent me a note about that she came upon in her research a couple of times where Gildersleeve just lets it rip, and it's hard to work that through. She is, as Ginsberg says, an Arabist, but that doesn't quite cut it. I mean, there were a lot of anti-Zionists who were Jews, but what else is there? I'm not sure. She has the Barnard faculty have more has proportionally as many Jews as the Columbia faculty in the 20s and 30s, but that means not very many at all. I count a half dozen, and I may be reaching out of 100, maybe 5%, and in limited fields, not in English. No, that's the Trilling. That's the Trilling story. Economics, okay, commercial. The break comes in art history of all places, but it comes not from Americans, but from the first wave of German Jewish exiles in 33 and 34. I mean, Held is one of them by 37, but there's a woman who precedes Held, Margaret Eber, who was an archaeologist and an art historian, quite prominent, had held a full professorship in Germany until those professorships were just taken away from them. And Gildersleeve had to have gone along with that, so it's still a mixed story.
That's only two, right? In the 30s?
Oh, two what, faculty? No, there were
Jewish faculty?
No, I count a half dozen. Well, in the 30s, yeah, but
no, I'm just
coming
curious
and
who was
going.
turned away.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, Columbia took even fewer. I mean, part of it was that they had guaranteed everybody a job throughout, but when you count up these people who become part of that intellectual emigre, Columbia doesn't do nearly as well as in terms of taking advantage of this new talent pool. But it's a different story. Okay, well, I think we ought to open it up unless...
Can I add one thing?
Please.
About Gildersleeve. I thought Roz was going to quote from her book. In her memoirs, Virginia Gildersleeve, when she talks about Annie Nathan Meyer, is not only patronizing, but the point of contention that Gildersleeve says is that she said Jews are a race, and Annie Meyer said, no, it's just a religion. And that conceptualizing, if you're grappling with, you know, why does Gildersleeve represent whatever she represents, I also think that all the really horrendous things that Butler did that were anti-Semitic, I don't see Gildersleeve objecting, but I do see Annie Meyer. But the idea of focusing on racism in terms of Jews in this period, I think is worth noting. And she's very clear about it. And it's a different story too, but I hope everyone knows that Annie Nathan Meyer went on to be one of the Miss Anns of the Harlem Renaissance. That her feeling for African Americans was extremely strong, and her archives are full of letters from James Weldon Johnson and all kinds of people. So here's a period, it's very mysterious to me, where people see race as being a definition of Jews and don't do much about it, and see race, it's the founding of the NAACP, which many Columbia and Barnard people were involved in, and they're all on campaigns against that kind of racism, but not anti-Semitism. They don't see it. They don't see sexism either.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of Virginia Gildersleeve's position.
It's complicated.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet, it's also, I mean, the Nathan Meyer thing is complicated. I remember a woman from the class of 1932, 33, telling me of being invited to Annie Nathan Meyer's apartment as an officer of the Menorah Club, the Menorah Society, which is the Jewish students, extracurricular club. And the dinner began with oysters and lobster bisque.
Wow.
Which,
that's all right.
is obviously not the most kosher of entrees. And I remember her turning to me and saying, "Who does that? If you know you're inviting the Jewish officers of the Jewish society, why would you do that?" And I think it goes back to that the German Jewish assimilation, Reform Judaism.
She was married at the Ethical Culture Society.
Right.
And she and her husband were members of that, which was also founded by a German Jew. From the time of their wedding, she severed her affiliation with Shirat Israel, which had been the family temple where Maud spoke from the pulpit. So it's a totally assimilated.
But I think that period also is interesting because, again, it's anecdotal, but talking to women from that period, when recalled that a Jewish girl was not allowed to win the French prize 2 years in a row. That was 1 year, okay, 2 years, not so much. Of being told by basically the career services at the time that you would never get a job as a teacher because you're Jewish, and so find something else. I mean, my favorite version of that is, and if Erin comes back, she may remember her name, but there was a woman from the class is actually in the 20s, the late 20s, who was told that, ended up going to Europe and ended up tutoring Coco Chanel in English. So it's kind of an interesting moment also in the 30s for Jews at Barnard. I think there are more of them, but it's still very fraught.
Oh yeah.
I must, here's an anecdote, but Barbara and you may remember this from CPAS years and years ago. There was a friend of Ginny Shaw's who'd never gotten her degree from the 1930s because the Nazi in the German department would not pass her.
I can't remember.
Something like that, and so we arranged for her finally to get her Barnard degree in the late 1980s. She'd gone on to be a pediatrician in Santa Fe or something like that, and had a perfectly fine life, but apparently some of the language departments did pose problems in those days.
Well, it's also interesting because the whole thing against the fraternities and stuff, because just a few years later, in 1918, there's actually a sort of similar debate over the role of the YWCA and whether or not it's even appropriate to have any kind of religious group on a college campus, and does it really you know, the YWCA's thing, well, we're bringing together everyone in a unity thing, and people argued, but, you know, why would then you need, you know, specific groups or specific religions to bring people together when you're obviously breaking people apart? And there's, you know, in the YWCA, at the beginning of Barnard's history, was a very strong social influence. They published the student handbook. They gave a huge reception to the freshmen that was attended by almost the entire college at the beginning of the year. And they sort of, and what was interesting though is that up until about the 19-teens, 1920, you could actually be an associate member of the YWCA and not actually be of a Protestant denomination. And in fact, Barnard even had a couple of Jewish members in like 1907, 1906. And then eventually what happens is that you have to declare you know, that you follow the teachings of Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior. And so obviously that knocks out a whole slew of people. And also then the Catholic contingent is sort of pushed out because you have to be a member of a Protestant division. So they go off and they form, you know, the Craigie Club and then the Newman Society and what have you. But in terms of talking about Barnard as a place where, you know, there's a little bit of pushback, I think there was also, nothing happened. I mean, they obviously didn't get rid of these societies, but there's kind of this moment, also around World War I, you know, where the ideas are bubbling up and there's a lot of push and pull and give and take.
There's a socialist club at Barnard.
Oh yeah, there's a socialist club.
Also drove Annie ballistic.
You know, women's suffrage club, college settlement, the whole.
But you would think the socialist club is heavily Jewish. I have no idea who was in it at Barnard, but certainly the Socialist Party was heavily Jewish.
It probably skews a little bit, but it's, you know, it's out there and stuff. It's actually interesting because with Freda Kirschway, you know, sort of slightly ironic thing, her sister, Dorothy, who's class of 1910, that class with the 40, is actually a member of a sorority. She's in Kappa Kappa Gamma, which is actually the one that Virginia Gildersleeve is the sort of faculty person involved with. The thing about Dorothy, though, is that, and it's very anecdotal, and it comes from a diary of a member of the class of 1911, Stella Bloccano, after she's married. And apparently Dorothy was very good friends with Elsie Plott. Elsie Plott, her family was the family that founded the company that produced Lysol and made quite a bit of money, but was Jewish. And there seems to have been just a sense of that this was an unusual friendship. You know, that they were kind of the exception to the rule a little bit of being so close. And Stella herself, it's fascinating to watch her over the course of her diary. She writes a diary from right before she comes to Barnard, basically through her Barnard career. And she's German Jewish and very much struggling with a sense of religious identity and whether or not she even believes in, you know, being Jewish or having religion, what have you. And she goes through these periods, and especially when it comes actually to the fraternities, because she admits, she says, I'm disapproving of them, I think they're snobby, I think they're discriminatory, and yet she's desperate to be in one. And she actually recounts the story of another girl, Marguerite Strauss, who's the class of 1908, who was actually denied entrance into one of the fraternities that all her friends were in because one person objected because she was Jewish. And she said, well, I don't care, you know, I'm proud to be friends with, in fact, with Agnes Ernst, and I don't mean to
She's
be,
not
who's not Jewish, actually.
Yeah, Bob.
She's married to a Jewish guy, but she's not, she
Right.
was Lutheran, I believe.
Yeah, down we go.
But,
There you go.
I
you know.
best I could.
Maybe she converted.
Every time you knock one off, the story gets worse.
I understand that. You know, but Stella talks about her own friendship with a non-Jewish friend, and they, you know, the non-Jewish friend, you know, comes around and says, you know, look, we don't mingle socially, we don't, you know, I mean, it was, And she writes about her mother preferring her to go with a Jewish crowd rather than with a mixed crowd. And so it's an interesting time. I'm at 40, it actually seems about right to me. I can see that. I think in those weird early years, there's a kind of very interesting mix of very wealthy Jewish members. And yet there's this, there is definitely this prejudice and this going back and forth.
Well, what do people make of this that I just showed? There was a Jewish sorority at Barnard. Started, do you know about this, Rona? In 1909, AE Phi was founded by 7 Jewish women.
AE Phi or AE Pi?
AE PHI.
Oh. All right, I know AE Pi is the male.
No,
version.
that's right.
Is there-
No. And it still exists as a national Jewish sorority, but it was abolished when the sororities. Does anyone know
That's
that? This
interesting.
really surprised me. The names are here.
Do you know who the names are?
Yeah, Helen Phillips, Ida Beck, Rose Gerstein, Augustus Tina Hess, Lee Reese, Rose Salmowitz, and Stella Strauss at Barnard College, October 24th, 1909.
I don't recognize that.
And then a branch in the same year started at Hunter College, and I'll let people
I
see
would
this.
wonder if that is.
But I don't know.
Where does that come from?
I can't even remember.
Okay. I'm wondering if
I
it
know.
was maybe an unofficial sort of thing. I mean, you could look in the mortar
Well,
boards.
why wouldn't, there was no prescription.
No.
against-
Right, no, this is.
But
from-
the question is,
It
would
might
it have
been a
been
legitimate
recognized?
response to being closed out of.
Well, it was, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I
Right,
assumed
but I
it
guess the
was.
question is, was it recognized officially?
Well, there's
as
no
part
official
of the-
recognition for anything.
Because you had to apply for a charter to
Really?
get a club
To be part of the
going.
national.
Hmm.
To be part
So,
of the
well, that
national
too, but
sorority.
no, at Barnard though, I believe, even at that time, you needed to apply, because like the
Well,
Menard
this quotes
Society
the mortar
applies for a
board,
charter.
so I'm sure it's legit. I just don't know what, yeah, obviously was a response to the,
Yeah.
Other,
surprised me about.
well, just to keep it going, there are some heroes in this situation, I think, and I apologize in this case, a hero rather than a heroine. Roz made reference to George Plimpton's papers. Plimpton is the treasurer, in fact, of Barnard from the beginning, 1889, till his death in 1936. When Jacob Schiff becomes a member of the board, he's announced as the treasurer, but he's got Plimpton doing all the work right from the beginning, raising all the money. And Schiff leaves, resigns from being treasurer, and the treasurer had all the functions of, the vice president for finance, except he didn't get paid. He was a member of the board. So for 40 odd years, Plimpton is the money guy. And everything I've been able to find in his pretty complete papers. I've also looked at, he was also simultaneously a trustee of Amherst, which was his college. But he commits inordinate amounts of time to keeping Barnard afloat, and it was always kind of, a 2-week advance sort of situation. And he seems to line up with the angels at every point. Has some problems with individuals, but he's the one who cultivates Schiff for the whole 20 years. And Schiff in 1909 says to Columbia, having given at that point $2 million to Columbia in little bits and pieces, 200,000, excuse me, in that day it would have been 2 million, that he's never going to give a dime to Columbia until it elects a Jewish trustee. He's already given several $100,000 to Harvard because Harvard was much more open at the trustee level. They really did, if you had the money, you were in. What was peculiar about the Columbia trustees was that they never gave very much at all. It was a kind of, to their minds, appropriate place for the head of a Knickerbocker family to become a member of the Board of Trustees. And you didn't give any more money than everybody else could because you didn't want to embarrass the other folks who might be down at the heels. Plimpton was chasing every dime in town. And I think both as a result of that, but I think also a different mindset. He was not a New Yorker by trade, so I think there was a certain difference there. He would solicit money from Jewish prospects, and when he would get some pushback, and a couple of times from Virginia Gildersleeve, are we ready to take this money? I think there's going to be a question about the naming of the building, and so on it would go. He would not only say, he would say more than just take the money and run. Is take the money, and we do with them what we've done with Fairweather, what we've done with Low, what we've done with Skirmahorn. And if they want to say it's not Jacob Schiff, it's Jacob Schiff's mother, you can call it the Mrs. Schiff building. But you have to deal with this. And he was also, I think, keenly aware of the need to keep Barnard, what he kept calling it, an urban school. And he knew what a country college was, because he was a loyal Amherst. But this was to be, in other words, the fear that everybody had who was on the side of restricted admissions was that Barnard would become a hunter. And not that for a period of time, there wasn't a hunter, but I mean, it was the woman's side. But that it would become, there'd be a tipping point, and that would be it. And that everybody knew, and you cited Mrs. Ligon,